I would like to once again introduce the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, who is responsible for environmental issues and climate change in the Caribbean community. So with that, sir, I'd like to introduce you to give a few remarks on this session. Thank you.
Thank you very well, and thank you for helping me with my timing. Honorable delegates at the head table, Prime Minister, the Honorable Keith Mitchell, Warren Smith, the President of CDB, my other colleagues. I'm going to take a very different approach today because, unfortunately, I'm often quoted now to say that time has run out on us on this issue. And I want to really separate the OECS, CARICOM, and more importantly, the SIDS around the world who have been patiently waiting for the world to get its act together. And I think that this summer was a very strong reminder that the time has run out on us. And I really want to quote Roosevelt Skerrit, the Prime Minister from Dominica, in his UN address, in which he likened what took place as a war. And unfortunately, it's a war that we didn't start, and it's a war that we can't end. And so we're on the front of this battle line. So I want to say to you that the SID countries have been advocating for years for more assistance to build a more resilient infrastructure to protect our economies. And that I mean that we continuously come to these events and there's mitigation and adaptation. And even in the agreement in Paris, only 20% of the funds were set aside for adaptation. And since the advent of Irma and Maria this summer, the need is now more critical than ever. And not only for the affected countries, but also for the ones that know it's only a matter of time before it's going to be our turn. There are 4 critical constraints that we've identified to solving this problem, meaning getting funds to help us in building resilience. So the first one was that the OECD and the ODA have been using per capita GDP, one single measurement to classify countries. And in that classification, all or most of the SIDS are either middle income or high level income countries. And the result of it have not had any access to the concessionary funds. The other one has been that access to sufficient funds. So again, when we continuously hear about monies being available, and we're all incredibly grateful for anything that we get, but the funds are grossly inadequate for the size of the problem that we have to face. The next one is the over-bureaucratic and time-consuming process to draw down funds. And it's something that we have to be able to address moving forward. And the last one is the impact of resilience building on our macroeconomic indicators, such as our debt to GDP. So we're saying that we have to think of a new way of how we're going to classify resilience building in terms from a loan perspective. I like to think that right now, to put us in the frame of mind that any Prime Minister in our region is right now, is to say that time is against us. Time is against us in that the opportunity cost that's being lost. So for instance, in my region, Dominica, St. Martin, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico are still struggling to recover. In fact, I think it's only 60%, only 40% of the people in Puerto Rico actually have electricity how many months later? And the same thing can be said for the French St. Martin, for the US territories, and for Dominica. And the opportunity cost that's being lost is that many of my nationals and nationals from Grenada and other countries actually were living in those islands and sending remittances back home. Many of the islands in the south were providing agricultural produce to those countries up north. And then the other one is that Puerto Rico, for instance, is the home port for the cruise industry. And because Puerto Rico is in the state it's in, because the other islands near Puerto Rico are also have been dramatically damaged, it's impacting the viability of that industry. So the monies that are being lost every single day, we could never recover that money. That's money that has just been lost and those opportunities are gone. Migration. So right now we're seeing on many of the islands, people are migrating. And the people that are migrating are the people that can afford to leave. And that tends to be your middle class and your upper class. And in small developing states, this is the backbone to your economy. These are the people who are the leaders in your community, your mother and father's groups, coaches in your teams, people who are sitting on your boards. And when those people leave, it's going to take a long time to convince them to be able to come back. And then the last one, which is the scariest one, is that in 9 months' time, the next hurricane season begins. And there is no message that we can send to anybody to say, please put a hold on the hurricane season coming, we're not ready, and wait for us to get our act together. So this is the reason that we need to take action now. And so the question becomes, what action in my mind is required? So first of all, I want to thank the UN General Secretary, and I also particularly want to thank the UK government that 2 weeks ago at the OECD meeting got the OECD to agree and to the ODA to agree that SID countries now would be treated differently, and that a new classification would be entered into, which would allow SID countries now to be able to have access to funding at a concessional rate. So, I mean, I think that's a huge stride that was made. And the reason why the UK government was so vested in this is that they fell into a problem in that the Anguilla and BVI, which are their territories, they were not allowed to send ODA funds to them because they were both middle income countries. But for whatever the reason is, I'm very, very grateful that the OECD has made that first step. There's a meeting this week with the IMF in Jamaica, which is a critical meeting. We're here at COP. There is a UN CARICOM emergency meeting for funding for the region, which has been set for New York, if I'm not mistaken, the 22nd and 23rd of November. And then the World Bank has also agreed to have a meeting in Paris in early December. So the critical issues that still need to be determined. First of all, is a dedicated source of funds to support resilience building. We need a firm commitment from the development countries for funds to be allocated for resilience and specifically for the SIDS. And maybe to provide some incentive to developed countries. Many of them are struggling to meet their 0.7% goal for ODA funds. Maybe for the case of SIDS, we can allow the contributing countries to get a quota of maybe 2 to 1 for every dollar that they're putting in towards meeting that 0.7% goal. We're currently preparing a white paper to develop what we're calling a resilience bond, and that would be a special purpose vehicle to attract private sector funds to be able to come in. And so the question becomes, what are the concessions that we have to be able to provide to allow the private sector to bring their funds to the table? And we're hoping that if we can get everybody to agree to this, and that the SIDS are the first line in benefiting from this, if it's successful, this is something that can be rolled out on a larger basis. We need to agree on new protocol to simplify the drawdown of funds allocated for resilience building. So what do we mean by that? If you take the OECS countries as an example, and CDB is generally where most of the funds are able to come in, most developing agencies and also individual countries have their own criteria for implementing funds. I think it's time where we can get them to harmonize on one process. By agreeing on that one process, it means now that we can prepare projects while we're waiting to identify funds. Whereas right now, we're literally having to rewrite project proposals on the basis of who we're going to get the monies from, which now is increasing the length to be able to get access to the funds. If in fact, and it probably is the case, that many of us do not have the necessary resources in project proposals, I think that there is a need to put together one team to assist us in identifying those projects and preparing those projects to become shovel ready. And then the other thing is time is against us. We can't sit here and accept that it takes 2 and 3 years or 4 years to be able to draw down on funds. It must happen quicker. And I liken it when I go to a country that's been affected by a disaster, all of a sudden people are moving much faster to get things done. So let's not wait for the hurricane to create a sense of urgency. Why don't we have that urgency now in order that we can resolve our problems? In terms of the IMF, I think that the ask of the IMF is that we need to figure out how we're going to classify the funds that we're borrowing. So the number one challenge facing us small countries is the amount of fiscal space that we have. So we have high debt, we have very little cash, and many of us are running deficit governments. So if in fact now there's an urgent need to spend this money for resilience building, and the money that you're going to spend is not adding any capacity. So what do I mean by that? If we have to raise the height of a bridge, but it only is going to carry the same number of vehicles it was carrying before. So it means it's an expenditure to build for resilience, but it's not adding any capacity. When I have to take all my utilities and put them underground, there is no capacity change. All I'm building is resilience. If I have to do slope stabilization, or I have to strengthen my rivers, all these are things that are absolutely necessary to protect my asset base, but they're not going to contribute significantly to my GDP growth. So given the circumstances we're in, if we are now to borrow monies for resilience building, even at concessionary rates, if we have to treat it as debt in the traditional way, we can't do it. So should this debt now be considered an off-balance sheet item? Or do we agree that we're going to amortize resilience building over a longer period of time? The last piece I want to say in closing up is sometimes we overcomplicate what resilience building is. So resilience building is slope stabilization. It is river stabilization, strengthening our rivers, broadening the shoulders so that if we have heavier rains, they can be carried out, raising the bridges, putting larger drains in place, putting our utilities underground and strengthening the existing roads and the essential service buildings. We no longer can use schools as our shelters because now after the hurricane, the schools need to go back into operation, but people's homes are still damaged and there's a conflict in that area. And then we need regional support. The Sedimas of the world need to get strengthened. I mean, the need for them to have their own equipment in the period of time, helicopters, boats, and planes, because we were completely dependent on everybody else's benevolence. And the hurricanes wiped out the northern part of the countries, Puerto Rico and the United States, where we would have traditionally gotten our support. So I just want to say that I'm here, and I'm going to continue championing the fact that we need assistance now. I'm hoping a decision that can come out of COP is to agree to allow the SIDS to be classified separately, and that we agree that we can implement a plan to resolve these issues, these what I call impediments to the ability for us to build resilience and to deal with the climate change issues. I thank you very much.